I think one of the things that came to mind when Alex was talking about homogeneity and how these cultural processes happen. I did most of my research and my fieldwork in the Peruvian Amazon rainforest. I lived there for almost 5 years, and the entry point to the Peruvian Amazon is a city called Iquitos, right? And Iquitos is a very unique place in the world because it's a pretty big city. It has a little bit over 500,000 people. But it's also a very isolated place. I think it's the biggest city in the world that is not connected by road to the rest of the road infrastructure of the country. So Iquitos, by all means, is an island, but accessibility is even more complicated than an island because you don't even have the ocean. You're basically stuck in the middle of the rainforest, and the only way in is through the rivers and by plane, right? So the rivers, like travel by rivers, commerce by rivers is even more complex than travel by ocean. So Iquitos is one of those places. For me, at least, it was the second time, like the first time that I arrived in Iquitos, it was the second time in my life where I had a very eerie experience that I wasn't traveling across space as much as I was traveling across time. The first time that happened was when I first arrived to Havana 15 years ago. But in Iquitos, right, because it's so isolated, there's a primacy of the local over the global. It's one of the only places in Peru where you won't find McDonald's, you won't find Starbucks, you won't find any chain restaurants. Like the only thing that exists is like the local cevicherias, the local chifas, the local things. And one of the primary political points for decades, right? Like every political party that wants to gain power in Iquitos, like the main point always is who is going to build the road that is going to connect Iquitos to the rest of Peru so we can finally bring progress, right? And it's always kind of like this dialectic, whereas the locals are always like, oh, like we really need to eat that Big Mac. We really want to have that Starbucks coffee. We really need to bring progress into the city because we want to join. We want Westernization to allow us to join the world in that sense. And then there's always kind of like, people like me or like other Western people and facilitators that live there that are always romanticizing and idealizing exactly that sense of the local, like that lack of globalized slope, right? Like you can walk in Iquitos in the street, again, like a big city, 500,000 people, and you won't be bombarded all the time by advertisements from big companies and corporations. I mean, there's a Nike shoes shop and so on. So that homogenizing process, when it's not there, it's something that is incredibly felt. It's something that is very, very, very evident. And there's still a diversity that enriches, so much the thing. And yet there's still a hunger from the part of the local people like, hey, like, I mean, yeah, we recognize, I mean, we love our culture, we love our, uniqueness, but we really, 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 really just want McDonald's in downtown. Like that's the thing that we want. That's the primary political point in the campaigns. So
yeah. People really want to plug into the global brain for some reason. Maybe they feel it's like maybe it's evolutionary, adaptive, like you want to be part of the hive or part of the whole or something. Even when it destroys, everything about it destroys the local culture. Like Helena Norbert Hodge is an anthropologist who studied the Ladakhi people in India, the Tibetan Buddhist culture, and she went there with the kind of superiority around Western culture. Then she was so moved by how they lived and how like they would, build each other's houses, and there was a fire, and the kids and the parents would come together and sing like the Tibetan songs or the folk songs and preserve every aspect of their culture. But then as soon as the Western, colonialist culture started to come in, everybody just adapted to it so quickly. And she said it was like an acid that ate through their whole society. Kids started like sniffing glue and, stabbing each other for Nikes, and they didn't want to sing the songs anymore. They just all wanted to listen to, Britney Spears or Taylor Swift. So it is this weird thing where people, immediately give up, in many cases, their local cultures. They sort of, when we see it so precious, they don't even value them as soon as they see that they have to be part of the global mind sphere or noosphere, whatever it is,
Yeah, it's also like really interesting. For example, in the small rural villages where I spent most of my time, they're very pretty poor communities. Like they don't really have access to many resources. They're mostly subsistence farmers, right? Like they grow crops that they allow them to live within their communities. Sometimes they have an extra chakra or two of yucca or corn that they sell in the market. And then with that money, they buy other, kind of like basic things. And they live in wooden shacks. They don't really have a lot of appliances or space. And there was like one of my best friends there, which I used to visit with twice a week to watch football, precisely because he was the kind of guy that lived in a wooden shack, had basically, one rusty bed, no mosquito nets in the house, and yet this huge antenna, like this huge satellite antenna that was able to catch the signal to watch the Champions League every Wednesday and every Tuesday in the afternoon, because that was the priority. That was, for him, it was like the priority. Well, I want to be able to watch European football twice a week in the middle of the jungle in my, shack, even if we don't really have many other things or more access to food or resources. But the most important thing for me is access to European football, because that is the thing that I want to watch. Right. So, watching Messi, watching Ronaldo once a week in the middle of the jungle, that was kind of like the goal. That was at least the idea of what joining the global village, or what progress was for him in terms of the commodities that he was interested in. And this is something that you find quite a lot in these sort of communities, right? Like, people perhaps don't really have many other things, but yet there's like this one thing or these two things, right? Like, they want to have access to Spotify, they want to have access to European football, and those are the things that they orient towards.
Adam, do you want to take it over? I mean, it's your time now if you want to. I don't know if Alex can stay with us. It'd be nice to have you guys engage a little bit more, but I know, Alex, you said you might have a cutoff.
I just have to go pick up my daughter, and then I'll be back here. Hopefully, she may beg me to take her to the park, which I may relent.
Well, if you can join us again, that'd be great. Thank you so much for your share. It's always wonderful to get your perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. I'll stay on and watch as I go.
So yeah, Adam, you want to take us away?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so like I started sharing, like I did like most of my research and field work. Right now, I'm finishing the last edits of my dissertation based on the work that I did in the rainforest. A lot of that was a few years that I spent working and living in an ayahuasca retreat center in the middle of the rainforest. And within that time, I was doing a few different research collaborations with different research groups, but also facilitating ayahuasca retreats and ayahuasca workshops. I mean, like quite a good chunk of that time I actually spent full time facilitating retreats and facilitating the ceremonies and so on. But one of the things that I was really interested in, the research part of it, was to try and find out what is it that people actually get from those retreats. Why do people fly, thousands of miles, oftentimes maybe 2 or 3 planes, to the heart of the rainforest, which is not a very accessible place, to go and drink psychoactive brews for a week or 2 weeks, 5, 7 ceremonies and so on. Like, what are the motivations behind it? And it's interesting because many of these things kind of connect to many of the topics that Alex was talking about. So in order to find out some of the questions that I have, one of the things that I did is that I did many interviews, right? So I would interview people that had just finished the retreats, on site. I probably have 120, 130 interviews that I did with people that had just finished a retreat, and basically asking them very basic questions about what was it that they got from the retreat, what did they learn, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that surprised me the most is that in the beginning, I guess my assumptions were still very much attached to something that I now have come to term healing culture. And healing culture is this concept that I use now to define kind of like the cultural soup in which we all swim within these converging communities of Western esotericism, New Age spirituality, popular psychology, psychedelic culture. There are many overlaps and adjacent, communities and scenes. Conspiracy culture, right? Very adjacent still. Like one of these words that people nowadays use a lot, conspirituality, to refer to that very interesting and very compatible convergence between self-spirituality or new spirituality and conspiracy culture. So you're kind of like identifying that cultural soup of healing culture. What are the different aspects? So, coming from that place of not really having examined yet what healing culture was, and still just kind of like blindly following many of the precepts of it, I assumed that most of the people that I interviewed would report back that the most important things that they got from the retreat had to do with one of two things: either their healing journey or their personal growth and personal development, right? Which is kind of like these are kind of like the two main narrative strands that conform the discourse of modern plant medicine, the plant medicine world. Like when we ask a person, hey, what is ayahuasca for? Then most of the time we will say, well, ayahuasca is a tool that can help you heal, or ayahuasca is a tool that can help you grow as a person or develop in different ways. And I mean, these things obviously are present, and people do use those terms to refer to the things that they got from their retreat experiences, healing in some ways and growing in some ways. And yet there was something very surprising for me, because as I continued to interview people, right, like these assumptions kind of like starting to dissolve, and I started realizing that there was one particular topic that people were almost always referring to that was also surprising for them, that it wasn't necessarily about their own healing journey or their own personal process or, kind of like their own development or their own metaphysical realization. It was something that was inherently relational, right? So they started identifying like, hey, what are the things that were the most interesting or more important or more healing for you during your retreat? And it wasn't so much like, oh, like the medicine showed me this, childhood trauma, and then I managed to heal it, or, like I grew in these ways. It was like, well, actually, one of the things that was most important for me was the connections that I made during my experience, right? Like the people that I was with during my retreat, the relationships that I forged during the whole experience, like those are the things that were really the most meaningful for me, right? And this wasn't just like, one or two people. It was very overwhelmingly common to find these sorts of narratives where people really pinpointed as a primary point of benefit to the relationships that they made during the retreat. And if not the relationships that they made, then other parts of relational healing that they experienced, right? A lot of people, for example, would go into the ceremonies, setting an intention, hey, like, Mother Ayahuasca or spirit plants or whatever the perceived agency was, like, hey, like I want to, I need you to help me heal from this trauma, or I want to work on my own sense of insecurity, or I want to work on self-love. And then during the ceremony, they ended up having this experience where they ended up having visions of their family members, whether father or mother or sister or brother or ex-partners, or even sometimes like estranged high school friends. And they're like, it was like the most unexpected thing, because I never really expected to go there, but I had a whole ceremony surrounding this girlfriend that I had in high school. And I haven't really thought about her for many, many years. And yes, I had this beautiful experience where I sort of kind of went back into that relationship and, had this beautiful relational healing. So the relational component started taking a lot of primacy in the narratives of people. And one of the things that then I started kind of like trying to isolate was something that I hadn't really paid much attention to before, that I also found that it wasn't really being very much talked about or discussed within, the psychedelic milieu, where there's such a high emphasis on integration, right? Like integration is kind of like this buzzword, or has been for many, many years, like like everybody's talking about integration, but nobody really knows what it means. Integration this, integration that, right? But what is integration really means? And a part of integration, right? Like it's kind of trying to define the different components of what a psychedelic experience can be like, including, of course, what is our orientation, right, during those experiences? Well, what is it, we are integrating something, but what is it we want to integrate based on what? There is a lot of emphasis on set and setting, right? Like we kind of like know, well, yeah, I mean, we should be paying attention a lot to our inner states. We want to be paying attention to our emotional present, like how are we feeling? We want to, the context of where the experience is happening, the physical space, the facilitation that is available, and so on and so forth. But there's one crucial component to the set and setting that I felt wasn't really being discussed a lot, and that's kind of like the discursive component of the set and setting, the narrative behind. Even before we go into ceremony, even before we join the retreat, there's already a world of information that is already being fed into our minds and our intentions and our thing, because there's a story behind it of what it is that ayahuasca is for, or what it is that psychedelics are for, or what it is that this retreat is supposed to be helping me with. There is a massive amount already of story, right, of this discourse that is already influencing a lot the experiences that people are having. And this, this discourse is everywhere. It's in the copy of the retreat centers, right? In the communications, in the emails that the retreat center is already sending. It's in the testimonials that people record in video, and then the retreat centers can like put out there that people can find on YouTube. It's in the popular discourse of books, popular books, and actually, like one of the, whenever the people actually arrived to the retreat center and they were before their first ceremonies, the Shipibo healers. I mean, we worked with not shamans, but they are self-described as Onanya, right? Onaya or Onayabo in the plural, which is a Shipibo word that derives from the word uni. The word uni is a Shipibo word for ayahuasca, and it translates to something like wisdom or knowledge, depends, right? So uni is knowledge, and the onaya is the person that knows, the person who knows how to work with uni, with knowledge. Yeah, like something that we would kind of like put into the cultural, social role of the shaman. So a Shipibo Onayabo would sit on the maloca, in the circle with the participants, and the first thing that they would say to them, right? The first thing that I would say to them will always be, everything that you think that you know about what ayahuasca is or what ayahuasca is for, we are asking you, please forget about it. Like, we don't want you to come into ceremony with any preconceived notions of anything. This is a medicine. This is supposed to work on my trauma. This is supposed to work on my personal development. This is supposed to be, there's already this whole, even people who never done psychedelics, which is the majority of people who arrive to these retreats, by the way, people who have never smoked a joint in their lives, and then suddenly they're signing up for 7 ayahuasca ceremonies. I don't know how that happens. I think it's insane, but that's the reality, right? Like, there's a bunch of different people who they never done psychedelics, they never tried a joint, and they're there, signed up, 7 ayahuasca ceremonies. They don't have any idea what they're into, but they actually do have an idea because they have, again, gone through the copy of the website, maybe read a book or two, maybe, watch Mike Pollan's show on Netflix and so on. And then they already have like a whole priming towards experiencing certain things based on the discourse and the narrative that they have been fed before that. Hence, the first thing that they would say, like, hey, we know you're here. We know we watched, we know you watch the testimonials and you read these books and you don't have all of these different things, but please forget everything that you think you know. Try to come into ceremony as clear as possible so you can actually experience whatever the ceremony can be like for you. And this is something that is impossible to do, right? Because we cannot really go into any experience with a clean slate. There's already going to be that expectation based on the knowledge and the narrative and the discourse that we have absorbed throughout, our research before that. So there is that, the discursive dimension of it that I always find to be very interesting, right? Like, nowadays, I think most of us can recognize that even though we do tend to assign agency to plants, and well, not all of us, but many of us do have that tendency to assign agency and intentionality and intelligence and sentience to plants or plant spirits or different, social actors with that network of interdependent relationships that is, the forest in particular, but life in a much broader sense. There is still that's never going to be the whole picture. Yeah, like there's a lot of facilitation clichés that I oftentimes make fun of, right? Like, mother ayahuasca never gives you what you want, but she always gives you what you need, right? Which is straight out of the Bible, by the way. I kind of made a comparison in my dissertation between all these different facilitation clichés in plant medicine and psychedelic world and their origins, which are almost always exclusively religious, right? So, God never tests you beyond your own limits, which is another facilitation cliche, right? Like the spirits of the plants will never test you beyond your own limits and so on. You have to surrender to the medicine, right? When surrender, you have to surrender to the medicine. So, all of these cliches, what they're pointing out to, of course, is that there's that agency, right? Like the ayahuasca has that agency, and she's going to deliver the experience that you need, not the one that you want, but she's going to deliver it, right? And I think nowadays we understand enough to at least acknowledge, right, that there is an interplay both between perhaps the external agency or some other mysterious factors that we don't fully understand, but at the same time, yeah, setting, the discourse, the narrative, the intention, all sorts of different things that are not necessarily driven by an external agency, but actually part, right, of that priming that we carry with us, that is both, our emotional state, but also the discourse and the narrative. So this facilitation clichés are something that I always find very interesting in that sense, to illuminate kind of like this tension, right, between the different aspects that create or can create the experience. So regardless of what it is, actually talking to the people, doing the interviews and so on and so forth, that started to illuminate. I mean, I'm just going back to that point, because I think that was the interesting part of it, right? Started realizing that actually, even when people arrive with narratives that are very, very specific, right? Like most people who, I mean, I won't say most people, but a big amount of people who arrive in the jungle to drink ayahuasca and so on and so forth do so, right? Because they absorb these ideas. For example, ayahuasca will help you resolve your traumas, or ayahuasca is very good for dealing with your depression. So people who come there, right, it's like, hey, I've been feeling depressed for a very long time, and I'm here because I want ayahuasca to help me depression, right, or anxiety, or trauma, or addiction, or all sorts of different diagnostic constructs that come from a very specific culture that are not necessarily part of the way that ayahuasca is perceived to be working there. And yet, when they're already there, right, and after they have these experiences, it's, most of the time people start to realize that depression or that anxiety or all the different things that they bring with them as expressions of affliction, right, have sources, obviously, that are much deeper than just, certain energetic deficiencies in the brain or the interplay of different neurotransmitters and so on, but something that is in a very real way rooted on deep social, cultural, and political issues that they're not necessarily exclusive to them, but actually are pretty common and widespread in the sorts of societies that we come from, right? And this is an interesting thing. When people start making that steps towards a vision of healing that is not exclusively based on a hyper-individualistic, super-personal healing journey that is only mine, some sort of hero's journey, but actually something that is more collective, something that is more interdependent, right? Like the way that people would express, as I said before, right? Like, hey, I came here thinking that I was just depressed because ABC, but actually, right, like the most meaningful experience that I had weren't necessarily in the ceremony where ayahuasca showed me, this particular thing that happened in my past, but after the ceremony where I was able to connect with this person and laugh with them. And then the day after, when we all had lunch together and I felt that sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in 20 years, right? And that sense of real intimacy with a group of people that perhaps were strangers 3 days ago, and yet now it feels like, we're bonded forever. There's a term in the anthropological literature, Communitas, right? This is Victor Turner. It kind of like talks about how this sense of communitas emerges in all sorts of different scenarios. There is a very unique experience of feeling that you are in true, real community with somebody, and that's an experience that emerges after very specific scenarios, such as, for example, ayahuasca ceremonies where people go through really difficult or at least really intense emotional experiences together. And there's something about the togetherness of those experiences, the shared togetherness of those experiences that bonds people together in a very powerful way, right? So people would say, well, yes, I mean, the depression is real, but the sources of it or the things that were fueling that depression, now I'm starting to understand that the genesis of it or the way that it unfolded was very different for me. And it was actually, because I hadn't really felt that sense of intimacy and connectedness to a group of people before, or, something that I missed for a long, long, long time, which was that sense of true communion or friendship or reciprocity or mutual responsibility for each other that oftentimes arises in these groups, even if it's temporary, which it is, right? I mean, this is a 10-day or 12-day container, and yet people are able to experience very powerful what that means, right? Like that sense of mutual responsibility, of understanding that, it's a very different system in which people are not necessarily in a hierarchical dynamic, whereas there's an expert looking at them and diagnosing them and then providing a treatment, and then they're becoming passive consumers of whatever treatment is being provided or dispensed to them, which again, this works perfectly in some situations. But it's a very different dynamic in which people make once you join a retreat or a ceremony in a general sense, you're also kind of like making an implicit commitment, right? That you're not there as a passive participant or consumer of anything, but an active co-creator and co-participant in an experience that is both deeply, deeply personal and individual, but at the same time, very powerfully shared and communal, right? And that entails also that powerful sense of mutual responsibility, of understanding like, hey, in the greater scheme of things, it starts becoming visible for people that being healthy and being happy is never going to be a purely individualistic pursuit, that there's layers and relationships, right? That individual health is always going to be intrinsically connected and linked to collective health, and that we can't be happy individuals if we're not living within healthy communities. And then expanding those layers, right? That healthy individuals and healthy communities exist within healthy societies, which exist within healthy cultures, which exist within healthy environments. And then all of these different layers are 100% non-negotiable if we're really aiming towards, what we would term healing in that sense, right? Like nobody can be fully healthy and happy if we don't have a community, or if the societies that we live in are completely dysfunctional, or if the culture in which we all feed from is just called the kind of slop that we've been talking about in some ways. If the environment is dying, it's very, very, when people come with anxiety, there's so many different layers to anxiety, right? But now, nowadays there's a term actually that is kind of being used also in clinical situations of, environmental anxiety, right? Like people come with an undefined sense of dread and doom and the deep, deep anxiety. And I go, well, it kind of like makes sense that you're anxious. Like it doesn't have to be seen through the lens of pathology. If you're a person who is minimally aware of what's happening and you're sensitive enough and you know the world that you live in, right? Who would not be anxious knowing the predicament that we're in collectively, right? And people start realizing, hey, you know what? Yeah, I am anxious, perhaps on one hand because I'm working 2 or 3 jobs, and barely able to pay rent, and I don't have any sort of housing security and so on. But at the same time, I'm also anxious because we have no fucking idea what kind of world we're going to leave to our kids in 20 years or 10 years from here now. Like we don't know what kind of environment. We don't know what the collapse of the Gulf Stream is going to be like in 5 years. We are starting more and more and more to feel that in our bones in the Western, privileged world. Things that, I think Terence McKenna used to say the apocalypse is already here. It's been here for many, many decades, just in less privileged pockets of the world. Like people in Kashmir, these are the kind of places where people have felt the things that we're just starting to feel in many ways. So, when people start making those connections between their own internal struggles or their own expressions of afflictions and what depression and anxiety mean beyond just a purely clinical individualistic lens, and making those connections between individual and society, individual and culture, individual and environment, that's where the real gold is. And this is also what people start realizing that I have, in my interviews. Those are the moments when I say, like, hey, great, that is progress, like allowing yourself to, or yanking yourself out of this never-ending loop of self-referential healing process of more therapy, more retreats, more, whatever it is that we consume as spiritual or therapeutically minded individuals, right? And actually starting to look at the picture from a wider lens. Yeah, like, well, it will never be enough if we're just stuck in this healing loop, as long as we're not also expanding that gaze outwards into the different layers of relation that exist between the individual and the other forms of organization. So that's kind of like the thing that I was mostly interested in, right? Like not necessarily ayahuasca as an individual technology, but actually as a collective, maybe I don't even have to call it, as a relational medicine, right? A medicine that focuses primarily on allowing the person to illuminate the relationship, but tying that back into the first thing, right? Like this is not a given. Like I think now we also, I mean, ayahuasca, I think, is different than other psychedelics because ayahuasca does seem to have innate orientation that is independent from human narrative. I'm saying this out loud and sort of maybe trying to see how that feels for me. But I mean, I do think that that's true. I think that ayahuasca mushrooms, natural entheogens, perhaps do have an innate orientation that is not necessarily completely tied to our own expectations or our own priming. And yet the narrative aspect still is important, right? If we send people to the retreat center saying, which is what happens, by the way, nowadays, I mean, the primary orientation is the trauma narrative, right? Like what my friend James called the trauma-delic culture, which is kind of like fed by all directions from, you know, influential figures, Gabor Mate and Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk, and so on, which has become kind of like the primary psychedelic orientation for the last decade or so, is the trauma-delic lens of it, right? Like anything other than using psychedelics for clearing out trauma and working through trauma is kind of like a waste of time, or at the very least, you know, what is the opposite of the sacred? A profane use of psychedelics. So, I mean, it's fine. I think it's great. I think definitely psychedelics can help, ayahuasca can help a lot with, you know, clearing out trauma, but also the narrative has to be the discursive. And I think this is one of the things that I personally would like to contribute and would like to see emerge from a more mature psychedelic culture in the next few years. Yeah, that we're able to pay much more attention collectively to the stories that we tell about what these things are and what they are for, and that we're able to provide better directions that aren't as narcissistically inclined or aren't as you know, insulated from the reality of the world around us, but rather, you know, orient towards the real predicaments that we're collectively facing. I mean, what, you know, and I've seen this multiple times with people who live in the rainforest, people who, you know, have spent maybe a decade or 2 decades drinking ayahuasca, and, you know, they have always these incredible metaphysical insights about the nature of reality, and yet they are unable to make that leap between acknowledging the relationship between the individual and the collective and the environmental. A lot of that is framed within this conspiritual, you know, bubble that, you know, that also kind of like inflicts all sorts of different streams of misinformation. I mean, you know, like it's not a big secret that there's a huge problem of climate denialism within spiritual and psychedelic and you know, cultures nowadays. So, you know, if you're drinking ayahuasca, you know, for 5 years or 10 years, and you're, you know, imbibing this precious brew that is, by the way, endangered in its native range, and it's a resource that needs to be protected, and yet we're still unable to actually make that simple leap into understanding that perhaps there is an environmental component to the healing that we need to be minded towards, then it seems to me like we're not really honoring that. And I think, you know, part of the responsibility, and I think, you know, something that Alex said before, of, you know, the recognizing that there's a problem and then trying to solve that problem and then creating more problems. Yes, I mean, we do that all the time. I think by problematizing stuff, oftentimes we do end up creating more and more problems. But I think, you know, at least from my personal perspective, and I think, Daniel, this is probably something that we share in common, I do feel there's a sense of urgency. I think if we don't actually orient towards the real existential predicaments that we're facing, then, I mean, what's the point of it? You know? And I think like part of that discursive aspect, part of that narrative component of the set and setting is something that definitely is being shaped and reshaped all the time, and something that we do have a responsibility towards. I mean, somebody in the comments saying, not to mention Trumpism in psychedelic cultures. I mean, yes, like this constant there are, you know, this constant flow of kind of like psychedelic spiritual culture towards right-wing minification. I mean, this is a real thing, and with it go all the things that are very common in those spheres, such as climate denialism. And yeah, I mean, I think maybe
Mhm.
maybe I maybe I shut up for a while and we can
That's great.
have a dialogue. You can pick it up.
I was reflecting on, I think the first time I wrote about ayahuasca was like 98 or something like that, 99. And then, then there was a spate of kind of rediscovery of psychedelia in the mainstream media. But at that point, it was kind of like some of the articles were positive, some of them were very negative, like the Vanity Fair article. And, people would sort of like absorb some of Terence McKenna's kind of ideas. They'd like talk about the elves or whatever. But then they didn't quite know how to handle it. Some people were just like overwhelmed. And then over time, the sort of narrative structure of the meaning of what it was became more and more solidified. And then, as you say, with the trauma-delic culture, it became completely fixed, is that you do this for certain kinds of healing and reconnection and so on. And then for me, it became kind of like, kind of like a static new kind of culture in a way, where I kind of started to lose interest. I'm kind of curious if you have any ideas, since you're studying it like anthropologically, is it still building, or is it kind of like crested? And is it, sort of like Burning Man seems to have kind of like crested and is now a little bit of the downward slope. Like there were like lots of tickets available. It wasn't like sold out last year.
Yeah, I think the psychedelic hype definitely peaked somewhere around maybe I think that the crest of the wave was the MAPS conference in Denver, 2023. I think from then onwards is definitely mellowing down. I think like that was probably an all-time high in terms of the crest of the wave of the hype. Which, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I think, again, like, we're talking a lot about dialectic processes. I think there was maybe 5 years before the convergence in Denver, where psychedelic culture was definitely off the rails in terms of the hype that was being created, in terms of the monetization and commodification of it, in terms of like, not really problematizing a lot of the real problems that exist within psychedelic culture when it comes to real dangers and risks that are involved. And I think now in the last few years there's definitely a wave of new lenses that are trying to not necessarily healing from healing, for example. Sometimes I get called out for being a little bit too cynical, which I completely understand, but at the end of the day, I think the goal always is to not necessarily criticize just for the sake of criticizing, but again, to try and bring that pendulum back into balance, into a cultural momentum that is not necessarily built on hype and prophetic vision. I mean, I don't know if anybody here was at that conference in Denver, but that was an incredible event for me. I mean, I remember the closing session of the Psychedelic Science 2023. Rick Doblin getting into that stage all dressed in white, with this huge image on the back of saying like, living in a trauma-free world by 2070. There was kind of like this incredible energy of like a true prophetic, culty, something that was kind of like already pointing out that the bubble was just about to break because it was not sustainable in terms of the messaging that it was putting outwards.
Yeah. What have you seen? I think who's the name of the guy who came up with the trauma-delic framing?
Brian James. He has a podcast, Howl in the Wild, I think. I can put it in the message. We made a few podcasts together exactly talking about these topics.
I enjoyed it. So what have you seen? So we were talking about, and that's kind of like, when I wrote Breaking Up in the Head, I wasn't so focused on the personal healing, perhaps to my detriment, because I probably needed to do more work in that area. But I was more interested in, what are these, how do these become tools for like thinking and for like sort of deconstructing, Western society, and then kind of like trying to like rebuild or redesign, which is something I still think about all the time. But, what about you? Like, what are you seeing? Like, what for you seems more like proper use or like exciting, inspiring use? Is it, what for you is on like the cutting edge in terms of, particularly as we're talking about the future of consciousness, the future of these kinds of investigations?
I mean, for me, I think one of the things that I felt very strongly, and this is maybe I mean, this is obviously based on a very deep personal bias because of my own experiences working in an extremely medicalized and psychologized environment for many years. I mean, as a ayahuasca retreat center that was extremely focused on the, paratherapeutic kind of like line of working with it in a very healing kind of way. But I think
Temple of Light one, or
yeah. But for me, I think one thing that I would be very excited about is to recover the true power of the recreational. To recover the true power of using substances in joyful, celebratory, recreational manners that are not necessarily geared towards utilitarian purposes or with a planned benefit in mind, something that kind of like breaks out from this neoliberal mindset of if you're not using this to grow or to heal or to produce or to advance your productive life in some ways, and it's useless, but actually kind of like more like really taking that step back. And in the Amazon rainforest, it's really funny because there's so many different ways in which ayahuasca and other psychedelics are used in traditional communities. There's a huge diversity of different ways in which people engage with these things. People don't necessarily know these things all the time because, again, like the dominant narratives are so centralized. We think, oh no, ayahuasca is a medicine and it's a medicine always, and it's only used within medical magical. But no, I mean, there's many occasions in many different communities ayahuasca is used in celebration, right? As a tool for social cohesion, as a tool for bringing people together. I mean, the Santo Daime do this, I think, very well, for example, right? As a way that is not necessarily built on this introspective shamanic healing, but something that is more outwardly, more dancing, more celebratory, more recreational, and so on. And, I got my initiations, again, like my personal bias, but I got my initiations in the psytrance European scenes of the early 2000s and so on. And my first the most powerful experiences that I ever had with psychedelics, by far, having experiences of being glued to the speaker for 12 hours with friends, with community, dancing our asses off, like that, experiencing the extreme points of joy and communion and fun. But like the fun, how much fun can a person have, with an environment that supports that fun? And I think,
isn't that what the festival culture is? That's what Burning Man is. Like people
I think it's what it was.
Hmm.
I think it is what it was. I think there's a difference between honoring fun and joy and then kind of just unrestrained hedonism, perhaps. Maybe there has to be a balance there that is better.
It's like a tinged into sort of just abandon or something like that.
But I think I think culturally we are already drowning in all sorts of different anxieties of how to be better, how to earn more money, how to heal this thing, how to grow as a person, how to a person has to be doing therapy and has to be doing there's also, and oftentimes, I mean, this is something, by the way, maybe to close just with this because it's kind of like a personal insight, but when my daughter was born, there was something that hit me really hard. And that thing was that I started noticing that, she would wake up early in the morning, earlier than me and my wife. And I would kind of wake up with her and go to her and kind of hold her and look at her, and this incredibly precious being that I love more than anything in the world. And just, be in that moment with my daughter in the early morning when there's nothing to do. And then slowly, after 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, and start this, hearing this creeping voice in the back of my head that is kind of like telling me, like, hey, like this is beautiful, but there's shit that needs to be done. There's coffee that needs to be made. There's work that needs to be done, and kind of like taking me out of that moment of darshan, this being. And I started noticing that all the time. There wasn't really a moment where I could actually be at peace, relaxed, like just enjoying the presence of my daughter, playing with her, doing something with her, without constantly having that knowing voice in the back of my head that says, basically, you should be doing something else. There's something more important all the time that needs to be done right now because A, B, C, whether it's financial or work or school, there's always kind of like that auto-exploitative drive that drives, I think, the neoliberal entrepreneur of the self, to use Foucault's terminology. And that drive, that auto-exploitative drive, I think is one of the most damaging things that we carry with us. And when I say recreational, when I say fun, I mean it as an antidote to that knowing voice in the back of my head that doesn't allow me to be present with my daughter for more than 5 minutes without having that sense of guilt and shame that I'm not doing something else that is more important, when in reality, there's nothing more important in the world, nothing more important in the world than being there with my daughter in that present moment and be with my full presence without that knowing voice in the back of my head that wants to take me out of the situation. So joy, recreation, presence, I mean, these things that I want to orient towards are more about like really being able to decolonize our mindset from this hyper-productive, auto-exploitative drive, I think, that is, you know, driving me crazy, and I imagine driving many of us as well crazy.
So I guess that would be sort of your orientation towards a possible future of consciousness, is kind of using what we figured out to kind of decolonize our own perceptions or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like decolonize our own anxieties when it comes to how should we be spending our time and what are the things that really matter. Like reprioritize, like being able to reprioritize things according to their actual level of importance and not according to their perceived level of importance based on cultural or social or economic strains.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you, Adam, for joining us. Great to hang out with you and everybody else. And we'll have one wrap-up session. I'll figure out when. I'll let you guys know. And maybe we'll send out a little survey about the course too. And thank you so much for being with us. And let's keep that evolution going.